tell me when you're ready, John, too, because I know you probably have people logging in or getting ready. And all right. Well, welcome everybody to the kickoff of Disability Heritage Month. We're really excited for all the different activities that are going to be happening this month. And, we've got posters around. I don't know all of the events off the top of my head, but one of them I do know that's really important that we get your participation is the seated volleyball tournament. And the seated volleyball tournament is on the 17th, 18th at 5:30. So put a team together, head over to Rec Services, IM Leagues online, and sign up a team. This is something we've been doing for several years, and it's really a lot of fun. It's a great way to get out and learn about adaptive sports, experience adaptive sports, and just and win prizes and have a whole heck of a lot of fun. We're going to have our biannual accessibility scavenger hunt on the 12th, on the 12th, and that's at 11:30 North Campus at the lumberjack statue. Thank you. See, I'm just the puppet. Lauren manipulates the words that come out. And this is it's a great opportunity for folks to join with several groups, take a look at accessibility, physical accessibility, and other types of accessibility in the environment around North Campus. In the spring, we'll do it again on South Campus. And we'll have construction management student groups participating with us, staff groups, people from facility services. And really, this is a great time and place for students to be able to have a voice into what they see happening around campus and maybe some changes they'd like to see or improvements that we can make for all of the campus community. The scavenger hunt has really created multiple changes around campus as students were able to come forward and talk about what they saw as barriers on campus that they would like to see removed, and in conjunction with facility services, really sort of get those on our roadmap for making campus just a more welcoming, accessible, and usable place for the entire community. So I'm skipping. There's a bunch of other opportunities to participate in Disability Heritage Month throughout the month. If you look on the Commission for Disability Access and Design's website, you'll see all of those events. You'll likely find all of those events on the DR website as well. And you can contact the folks at NAU for All or go to an NAU for All meeting and learn more and get involved and participate. So I'm really pleased that to kick off Disability Heritage Month, and I'm pleased because I think this is going to be a great kickoff and a great experience for all of you to have with us Amanda Kraus from the University of Arizona. So Amanda is Assistant Vice President for Campus Life, where she oversees the Disability Resources Center, but also Housing and Residence Life. Do you call it Housing and Residence Life? Okay, cool, because we're calling it the same stuff. So Amanda has been at the University of Arizona for 17 years, first as a student, then as a director and the deputy director for Disability Resources Center for many years. She also teaches disability studies on campus through some of the programs there. And she's really a nationally known speaker on design, universal design, inclusive design, ableism, and I'm proud to call her a friend and a colleague, and someone that I learn from all the time. It's been my pleasure to serve on the board of the Association of Higher Education and Disability with her. She is the current president-elect, so in a couple of years she will become the president of AHEAD, the 5th president from Arizona, if you can imagine that. So I just think you're going to have an amazing experience. I know everyone that comes in contact with Amanda and this presentation and all of her work learns so much and walks out with a lot of energy. We were just talking about that. The energy of this presentation is really takes on a life of its own. So please engage in the conversation. It's participatory. I'll let Amanda take it over and lead us through, but without further ado, Amanda Kraus.
Thank you. Thank you to Jamie and Chris and Lauren and Dorian, lots of folks for the invitation, and more to let me escape the Tucson heat because it's still in the 90s in Tucson, so it's nice to experience fall. But thanks for letting me be a part of your Disability Heritage Month. I think it's really great that you all do this, and we at U of A and really lots of universities and colleges around the country look to NAU for all of your innovation and the progressive ways that you offer services and incorporate disability studies. So this is a really cool place to be, and Arizona is a good place to be to learn about this stuff. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to chatting with you this afternoon. It's late on a Friday, but thank you for being here. Like Jamie said, I welcome your participation, and for those of you connecting with us via Adobe Connect, we welcome your questions as well. Jump in at any time with questions, but you'll see pretty quickly that this is a very interactive workshop because I've compiled a lot of media to share and kind of analyze with you to try to understand ableism and how some of the stereotypes about disability and some of the ways that bias and microaggressions manifest are really pervasive throughout our society. So we'll go ahead and get started. I am using a PowerPoint, but something that I like to share explicitly when I teach or when I do workshops is that I am committed to reading everything on the screen and describing every image because I think for a lot of reasons it creates a more inclusive environment. So that's something that I've just started to do and feels pretty natural to me now. And when folks don't do it, I react to it when I'm in a room or in a workshop. And you know, one of my pet peeves is like, well, I know you all can read, so I'm just gonna, you know, right? So yeah, I know that. So it's just something that I like to say because I think it's helpful. So in terms of an overview or kind of how I think about stereotypes and bias and microaggressions and a little bit of a flow for this afternoon's conversation, I will do a little short slide on disability history. I'm not a disability historian. I do borrow from disability studies a bit in my work, but I'm not an expert on disability history, but I do think it's important to discuss some of the themes because disabled people share a history of oppression, which is important to appreciate as we try to introduce disability into our conversation on social justice, which doesn't always happen. And so we want to start from there, start from how the history has informed our contemporary experiences and ideas, and how history informs stereotypes and bias specifically. And then we will start to talk about microaggressions, which we'll define and discuss, but I think are really the everyday manifestations of this history and of these stereotypes and these biases that really shape the disability experience. And then we'll talk a little bit about our practice, right? And I appreciate that lots of you in the room, I'm guessing, are students, but our practice, our attitudes, how these things inform our experience as members of a university community. So we'll try to share some real examples and talk through them. Before we get too far into it, I'm going to offer some terms because I'm going to use certain terms and language this afternoon, and it's good to be on the same page. And I also would welcome you to, to share anything or add or tweak these terms. But I've already said social justice, and a definition of social justice is a society that affords all groups full and equal participation, equitable distribution of resources, a society where members are safe, and people refer to social justice as both a process and a goal. Privilege is the benefits bestowed upon someone based on their membership or perceived membership in a dominant group. Usually privilege is unearned, right? That means we were born into this category. There are very few exceptions to this. Socioeconomic status might be one, but disability could be one too, where you can acquire a disability at any point in your life. But oftentimes this is unearned. It really has nothing to do with how hard we try or how smart we are or how cool we are, right? Power is what the benefits of privilege yield, right? So people in positions of privilege or with privileged identities have a lot of power in society. Oppression is the flip side of that. Discrimination, bias, bigotry, the lack of power or access, and it's experienced by members of a subordinated group. Oppression can be structural or institutional, and it can also be individual, right? So it's important for us to pay attention to these structural or institutional examples of oppression or ableism, because those of us connected to an organization like an institution of higher education can appreciate how some of our policies and processes and spaces, right, further oppress certain individuals, exclude them. And social construction, I thought I'd share collective behavior or ideas created by and agreed upon by members of a certain culture. So sometimes we hear social construction of gender. I would offer, or race, or really many categories, but I would offer that disability is also socially constructed, right? So we, as a society, kind of agreed upon, not formally in a room or in a meeting, but we kind of know what disability means and what it means to be a disabled person. And so some of that we're going to unpack this afternoon. How do we know? Well, we know because we keep engaging with these messages, right? In the media, in our language, in our practices, in our policies. That's how we know. There's lots of ways we learn what disability means. And so today we're going to start to really take some of that apart. Any questions or things folks would like to add or take away from any of these terms? Kind of familiar to you all? Okay. So 3 characteristics of systems organized around privilege. So in this case, we're talking non-disability privilege. And that's nuanced, right? It's not just you have non-disability privilege or you don't, right? But there's layers to that. But for the sake of this short conversation, members of the dominant group, how do we know that a society is characterized around privilege or organized around privilege? That's really non-disability privilege. So it's dominated by non-disabled people. It centers all of our practices and everything centers around, so we center everything around non-disabled people. And we identify this particular system or community or organization with non-disabled people. And there's like a few images that I don't think are that helpful to making these points. But there's little stick figures on targets, right? So there's a marionette. So happens to be a white, looks like a male hand holding the marionette strings, right? And there's a target or a bullseye in the background. So dominated by. There's a bullseye on the ground with lots of identical stick figures kind of over the whole bullseye. And then there's, a blue bullseye standing up, arms up, right in the middle, or blue character right in the middle of the bullseye, just to kind of help us remember that, at least for higher education, maybe a system that we'll think a little bit about this afternoon, really this system is organized around privilege on a lot of levels. Higher education is exclusive, it's competitive, and today we're talking about disability. And so really for the most part, our policies, practices, spaces, assumptions about higher ed really are all based on and based around the non-disability experience or the non-disabled experience. Okay, here's that quick slide on disability history. So again, disabled people share a history of oppression. And I don't know, has anybody ever taken a disability history class? Or has anyone learned about disability history in any of their other classes? A few hands, 3, 4, 5 hands, 6, 7. Okay, good. This is more than I've ever had before. Good job, NAU. I've never really learned about disability history, and I was a history major in college. So a lot of the stuff that I've learned has been just through my own research and through good colleagues and kind of what's going on in the profession. So just as a quick way to demonstrate some of the historical beliefs and then historical treatment, I made a very, very simple table. But I would say that since the dawn of time, disability has been characterized in some pretty egregious ways, and there have been some pretty horrific assumptions about disability and disabled people. Some of those beliefs is that disabled people were possessed, so possessed by the devil, that they were immoral or sinned themselves, or their families had sinned and disability was a punishment for that sin. Defective, right? Something's wrong with them. That they were a danger to themselves and others, that disability and disabled people were contagious, and that they were incapable of independence. So they really needed to be dependent on a non-disabled person. And so how did community or how did society respond? Through exploitation, experimentation, sterilization, and institutionalization. And again, you know, I have some images that I'll describe. These images might seem really upsetting, but this is still, I would argue a lot of these beliefs and a lot of this treatment is still alive and well. And even if we're not, there's an image here of burning somebody at the stake, even if we're not burning people at the stake anymore to respond to disability, there are still ways that we as a society exploit and exclude disabled people. So some images to represent these beliefs or this treatment. There's a sketch of someone being burned at the stake. There's a black and white photograph of a sideshow, circus, right? So there's a big banner that says human freaks on display, and there's a crowd of people around a stage where I believe that there are disabled people being presented and exploited. The next image is a chart of Nazi symbols. So Nazi Germany, disabled people were also a category who were systematically experimented upon and exterminated. And then the last image is a black and white photograph of an institution, and all you can see are rows and rows of cots, basically. You know, institutions, these things, there are still a few functioning institutions, right? This is not a long time ago that based on, again, what we think we know or some of these beliefs about disability that we put them away, right? And some of that was for their own protection, for their own safety. Some of it was to protect non-disabled people from disabled people. But of course, there was a lot of exploitation and abuse that went on in institutions, and it wasn't until the 70s, really, that institutions began to be shut down. So I think, especially as we have this particular conversation today on stereotypes and bias, that we are going to be able to appreciate how a lot of these ideas still permeate our thinking on disability. And something that I think is important to share is that we've all been socialized this way. And of course, I'm coming from like an American, very Western perspective, but I mean as a disabled person, so I use a wheelchair, born with a disability, born with an impairment. But we've all been socialized to believe this stuff about disability, disabled and non-disabled people. And so that's how ableism is so tricky. It's so pervasive. So this is a little bit of a historical context for the rest of our conversation. Some more definitions. What do we think we know? I always like to say that about disability because I think one of the biggest problems or opportunities at an institution of higher education is that people think they know, right? They think they know what it must be like to use a wheelchair. They think they know what it must be like to be disabled in some way. And I would guess that what they think they know is based on stereotypes and bias, right? It's based on what we get in the media, and it's based on kind of perpetuating these ideas. So a stereotype is a noun, a widely held, fixed, oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. Bias, also a noun, prejudice or tendency in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. Usually bias is considered to be unfair, and bias can be conscious or unconscious. So any questions or reactions to those definitions? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So your question is about exploitation and how what I heard you just say was your understanding of exploitation is taking advantage of someone and then benefiting somehow with resources. Um, I would agree, right? I think that that is a pretty solid definition of exploitation. Um, I think that part of that is disenfranchising or further marginalizing a subordinated group. So in this case, the disability community. And then you do benefit as a non-disabled person, even if you don't get something directly like money. You might, like at the circus, somebody got paid to have those people on display, right? Probably wasn't them. But you benefit because it further solidifies your position of power, right? And then I think we'll talk about inspiration a lot this afternoon. And I would offer that inspiration can also be exploitative, right? So thinking about charities or telethons, have folks watched or engaged with Stella Young's talk on inspiration? And she calls it inspiration porn, right? Which is objectifying one group. So porn is objectifying one group for the benefit of another, right? And so oftentimes disabled people are objectified, exploited for the benefit of non-disabled people. So I think you are absolutely right. And I bet that through some of our conversation this afternoon, it'll become even clearer. Yeah. Okay, some notes on bias. So I mentioned that bias can be conscious or unconscious. And sometimes we know we're operationalizing bias, but most of the time we don't, right? Sometimes people will say, like, I've had a bad experience before, right? And now I just don't trust that group of people. But a lot of times, because we've been socialized to believe certain things, which means we haven't necessarily been taught it in a classroom or by a teacher or by someone like our parents. We just kind of know things to be true. And that's hard. So if we're going to do social justice work, this is the work, right? Is unlearning and unpacking and checking ourselves on what may or may not be some sort of bias, right, that we're acting on. So implicit bias is the automatic association people make between groups of people, formed by stereotypes largely of those groups. Implicit bias just comes from normal cognitive processes, right? And all of us are biased, right? All of us. And we can be, right, the best advocates and the best activists and be committed to social justice. And I would imagine that I would bet everybody in the room would identify with that somehow. And that's probably why you're here on a Friday afternoon. And we're still biased, right? And we're still ableist and we're still racist and we're still sexist because this is like the water we're swimming in. So we have to actively, again, identify and unlearn this stuff. Stereotypes affect our assessments of others, even when we don't mean it to, right? And an assessment, is kind of like, I'm going to form an opinion about you. But also assessment is like, I'm a faculty member and I actually grade you, right? I give you a grade. So your whole academic career is on in some level, right, could be messed up by bias or informed or shaped by bias. So yeah, it informs our expectations, how we evaluate people, how we engage, all of our attitudes, right? It's a lot to think about, but it's good to acknowledge. So this is a slide about the Harvard's Project Implicit. Has anyone ever taken one of these tests online? A few folks are nodding. So there's the logo for Project Implicit. So this has been going on, I would guess 15 years, where you can voluntarily take one of these tests. And you can choose from a number of groups. And it tests your level of bias about this group. And it tests you by taking kind of the dominant and the subordinated representation of the group. So disabled, non-disabled, white, person of color, straight, LGBTQ, right? I mean, so really kind of a very dichotomous look at a community. And so they track and they assess how quickly you associate good words with the dominant group and bad words with the subordinated group. And then they swap that. So how quickly then can you associate good words with the subordinated group and bad words with the dominant group? And that's how they determine the kind of bias or the level of bias you have. So these are pretty interesting. They don't take all that much time. And so Harvard, after many years of collecting this data, has put forth some findings. And the majority of the people who took these little tests prefer white people over people of color, non-disabled people over disabled people, young over old, and have significantly more negative attitudes toward gay and lesbian people than they would express consciously, right? Which is sadly not surprising, right? So they're seeing that in fact we are biased. right? And I don't know who might take these tests. Sometimes you're required to for a class. But again, I believe that people who are interested in social justice would take these tests. And they're still coming up biased, right? So it just speaks to how deep these ideas run and how much work we all have to do as a society, as individuals. So some stereotypes about disability. I have two columns, negative and quote unquote positive. So some negative stereotypes about disability or disabled people is that they're tragic or pitiful, scary, lazy, liars, and that they're angry, right? They have a chip on their shoulder. The quote unquote positive list is that disabled people are inspirational, they're heroic, special, resilient, and that they deserve preferential treatment, right? So they deserve help, they need help, they deserve attention, right? So why did I put positive in quotes, do you all think? Yeah. Yes, because even positive stereotypes can dehumanize people. Thank you. Right? They're still coming from a place of bias. Right? So we have to be mindful of the expectations or the standards that we hold for other people. Right? And so when someone is being hailed as inspirational for doing something kind of ordinary, I mean, that tells us a lot about the person who thinks it's inspirational, right? Of what type of expectations we hold for the other person, in this case, maybe the disabled person. Any other questions or reactions to this list, Jamie? Yeah, right. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that inspiration comes from a place of fear because people are afraid of not just of disabled people, although I think they are personally, but of something like that happening to them or someone that they love, right? So fear is really an important theme, I think, that shapes the disability experience. And because I'm so afraid of this happening, I could never imagine that happening to me. You're such an inspiration for opening the door for yourself, right? Or for going to college or for driving a car, for things that really what I think it comes down to is that person could not imagine how that's done. And for that person, it would be hard, right? And I don't know, other disabled people in the room, like you learn stuff, right? Like, so sometimes things are hard in the beginning, but you learn them and you develop strategies. And someone who doesn't have that experience just can't imagine how that could ever become easy or normal, right? And so then it is like this looking up to that person, like, wow, you really did this, and I can't imagine ever doing that myself. Yeah, there's a hand in the back. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So you're asking about this person's noticing that I've used disabled versus person with a disability. So I'm happy to explain that. I don't know that there's been a shift. I think if you are looking to disability studies to inform your language, that disability studies would support disabled person or identity first language for a lot of reasons versus person first. So we'll come back to person first. I identify as a disabled woman or a disabled person because I believe that I am disabled by the environment, right? So are folks kind of familiar with that thinking on disability, that the environment is designed to exclude people with impairments? And I think you could take that framework and say the environment is designed to exclude a lot of subordinated groups, right? And that's what subordinates them, is this exclusion or oppression. So I believe I'm a person with an impairment who is disabled by the environment. Disabled is, I think, a political experience and a political category. So if I was trying to talk about or write about or come together around something, I would come together with other disabled people. Person first, really came out of political correctness, I would say, in the 80s and 90s. A lot of people preference that. That's their choice, right? And so the idea there was because disability was so bad, really, that you wanted to see the person first. You didn't want to define a whole person by this deficit, right? And so I find that offensive, and it's not congruent for me with what my values are on this experience, right? So it's inconsistent. I don't call myself a person who is white or a person who is a woman, even though I identify as a white woman. I don't want to distance myself from disability because it is so much a part of who I am and how I navigate the world. And I also don't want another person telling me how bad disability is, right? If I've claimed it or own it in a different way, then that's up to me. So really, it does come from a deficit model. Because if you imagine all of your multiple identities, right, all the things that make us who we are, and some that are really salient, really important to you, and if another person, probably not from that group, not from that community, wouldn't even say it to you, right, like would never dare call you that, would make a point to distance you from that, right? Does that, I mean, it's problematic, right? I can't distance myself from disability. I don't want to either. So that's my opinion, right? But I've also learned that not everybody agrees with me. So, when I'm teaching or writing or engaging folks, I will usually switch back and forth. I learned this from Andy Imparato from the USETs, right? I mean, you can't alienate people immediately, right? If you want to have a good conversation with them. So if I insisted that everyone identify identity first language and right person first language is offensive, I would lose a lot of people, right? And that's not the spirit of education either. And people are entitled to their own opinions, but this one's mine. So thanks for asking. Does that help? Do people have questions about language while we're chatting? Yeah. Okay. I know they did. I know they taught you in your disability studies and your special ed class to use person first language. Most of us have been taught to use person first language because that's palatable, because a lot of people in the community or peripheral, adjacent to the community, parents, teachers, professionals, um, promote that thinking. But again, if we didn't think disability was so bad, we wouldn't have to use person first language, right? Yeah. I know it's a hard shift because there are certain things that we've all been taught, right? Person first language, how to interpret the ADA, right? These things we have been taught. And then there's some newer thinking that really challenges what we think we know. Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah. Yep. Thank you for sharing. Okay. Sure. The categories, like diagnostic categories or the word disability? Okay. All right. I mean, I would say I agree. I agree that I'm a disabled person who has abilities as well. With the term able-bodied that a lot of people use, particularly in the athletics community. I'm able-bodied, right? I'm an athlete. I rarely get sick. I use a wheelchair, but so I don't see how those things are mutually exclusive. So I think you can be a person with impairment um, and disabled, and also very talented, right, and competent, and have a lot of power and privilege, right? So I might not have mobility privilege, but with respect to disability, I have a lot of other privilege. I have a job, and right, I mean, there's all these other things. I'm white. All of this stuff. But I think some of what I'm hearing from what you just said is still perhaps a belief that disability is a bad thing. And if it weren't, then we could say it. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. Um, I'm also going to make some assumptions about some other categories that you might identify with. And I think that there's a need to have language and labels and categories to claim some identity, especially when it's been erased throughout history. And I think that, we are all humans physiologically, but we do not experience the world in the same ways. And so I believe actually that language is very important and that these categories are very important, right, in response to some of the historical stuff, but also the contemporary stuff that's going on. I think to what you're saying, I think we need to reframe what some of these ideas, some of these words mean, right? So the ideas that disability promotes or the connotations of disability is what we need to address. Because then I think we could say it as a neutral. We could say it as something that's a source of pride or community. I think with lots of subordinated categories, the language or the term is just so steeped with oppression and deficit and less than that. Yeah, they're charged, right? Language around political identity categories is tough, but I don't think eliminating them is as effective as naming them and claiming them and reframing, right, what they represent. Yes, Dorian. Mm-hmm. 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 I mean, right. Right. So your question is about particular descriptors and the girl in the wheelchair and the guy with the dog and right. Well, yeah.
And sorry, I have someone online
Yeah.
just asking to repeat the question as best you can.
I'm trying.
I know, very much
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what
Thank you.
again? What I'm hearing you ask about is descriptors like the woman in the wheelchair, the guy with the cane, or the chick with the dog, and how that fits into our conversation because we're not supposed to say the blind guy. Right. Well, I don't know that we're not supposed to say the blind guy. I think a lot of this, what I'm hearing from you both, is still an underlying, like, internalized belief, whether or not we know it, right, that these things would be bad or offensive. And I would challenge that, right? Like, you do have a dog and I do use a wheelchair, right? And so I think we need to name these things and we need to talk about them. And I would guess that the most effective way, if somebody was trying to say, like, who's Amanda, who's the one from U of A, she's there, she uses a wheelchair, she has dark hair, right? I mean, that's effective. And it's true, I do use a wheelchair. Yes. Well, I mean, it's not a huge point of contention, but somebody who's in a wheelchair, kind of, it's reminiscent of wheelchair bound or confined to a chair, but using it is a little bit more empowering. But again, not going to split hairs there. But I kind of want folks to reflect on, if we were to say it, how would that feel? Right. I mean, and I think that some of this, and as a white person, I'm cautious, but some of this reminds me of color blindness, right? Like, well, I don't see color because you're just so smart and great. And right. And I've had people tell me too, like, I don't even see your wheelchair. And I'm like, you're lying, like, and like, why? Yeah, I know. Chris is not lying. Yeah. Right. So I'm okay with that, right? Like I know I use a wheelchair, right? This is okay. So ignoring important parts of people is problematic, especially when you are not a member of that community, right? So we need to see people and engage people, all of them, the whole person, right? All of their identities. And when I think especially problematic is we talk about some and not others. Well, no wonder the disability community is behind in social justice, right? In kind of rallying around civil rights or human rights or disability rights. We can't even agree on a term, right? And so this happens a lot in conversations about disability where language is hard for folks. And I think, yeah, it's hard for the whole community, right? And I do believe that that's why we're a little behind with respect to access and justice. So anyway, I think it's important to say these things. I think it's important to name them. And we shouldn't assume that someone would be offended. Why would we be offended if it's something we didn't believe was bad? Right? Yeah. Thanks. You like the reframing idea. I'm going to repeat what you say. Yeah. Oh, God. I know. So you hear the positives a lot as someone who works in the disability community or with the disability community. So you're doing God's work because you work with disabled students, right? Yeah, I know. I've never gotten that, actually. So I know that that's something that my colleagues experience, whether they're disabled or not, or whether their disability is invisible. Also problematic, right? Because not to take us too far off course, but I would, I believe that disability resources and disability in higher education is really doing the institution's work around access and not necessarily fixing or helping any poor disabled students, right? Everyone who got into NAU via the same standards. You all were hired by the same competitive standards. So there's really, you're mitigating institutional barriers, right? So you're doing the institution's work. So quick reframing there for the next time somebody calls you a hero. I'm going to move on. So there's some more language. I think we would agree that these terms are problematic or offensive: crazy, spaz, lame, retard, gimp, freak, maniac, invalid, psycho, or lunatic. So I've chosen some of these words are representative of words that are fairly commonly used today, not to talk about disability or define or identify disability, but to describe what? Behavior that's bad, right? So the unpleasant, right? So these are words we use to describe negative things or bad things, right? That's so crazy. That's lame. You're such a spaz. These are words that are rooted in disability, and we don't use them to describe disability, and we don't use them to describe positive or neutral things. We use them to describe bad or weird things. Metaphor. I have a whole slide here on metaphors. Metaphors are descriptors. And I think what's interesting is that they are really consistent and they are othering, and they're not so subtle, right? When I read them to you. She turned a blind eye. It fell on deaf ears. The economy was crippled with debt. He's a real stand-up guy. You'd have to be crazy to, blah, blah. I was paralyzed with fear. He's a lame duck candidate. I can run circles around her. You have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, right? She cut him off at the knees. Yeah. Wow, she says. Yeah. So these are ways that even our language, when we don't intend to, right? These are not hate crimes, right? These are not ways that we're trying to be mean or even be hateful. These are ways that our language commonly reflects that disability is something bad and that the absence of disability or hyperability is something good. Chris. Mm-hmm. Sure. So you're asking about the word crippled in this example, and then words like crip and gimp as acceptable identifiers. So And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. In the disability community, certain words that have historically been used to oppress disabled people have been reclaimed. And so there's a lot of literature that would refer to crip culture, or using crip as a verb to crip the classroom, to crip the system, crip the vote, right? It was a campaign a couple of years ago. GIMP, Spaz. I mean, I see it a lot in the athletics community, but I also observe disabled people calling each other crips and GIMPs. It's personally not something that I do, but even though I was born with a disability, I came into the disability community very late, like in my late 20s. And I think I just can't do it at this point in my life. But I'm cool with it when other people do. So I think it's an issue of inside or outsider language and reclaiming historically oppressive words. Do you have thoughts about it, Chris? Mm-hmm. Right. So you're talking about crip queer studies or theory that inform disability studies. I know that too, but I'm not good at it yet. I went to this like workshop with a bunch of faculty in higher ed who do disability work, and I felt a little bit like an outsider. I'm faculty, but that's not my primary role. And then right away they were like, wait, none of us get crip theory, and I was like, thank God. Right, like, so, and that was one of the critiques in terms of how applicable research can be if even scholars don't understand it. So there's some real esoteric stuff that's born out of disability studies, which I think is pretty simply just something that looks at disability and analyzes how it's represented. So I think crip studies would be even more critical. And there's crip feminist and crip queer feminist. So it's like this endless body of theory, but I don't get it yet entirely. Huh? Neither does Chris. That makes me feel better. Okay. This is a slide called Media Bingo, and then we're going to get into some images that perhaps reflect some of these ideas. But this was something that I received, and initially it was presented like a bingo sheet. So squares where, there's a star in the middle and you make a line, as you check off a box every time you hear one of these things, and you see how quickly when you turn on the news you can get bingo. So cool. So it says, so these are the things that you would look for or listen for when you're watching the news. She didn't let her disability stop her, right? He suffers from a particular condition. Someone who's confined to a wheelchair, the disabled, right? So again, talking about disabled people like this monolithic category, you don't do that for other groups. You don't say the men. You would never say the men. The assumption is the men. You wouldn't say the gays or the women, but you still say the blind, the deaf, the disabled, right? If you saw her doing anything else, you'd never know she was disabled. Right? Defying the odds. Most of us could never imagine, right, to our earlier conversation, this horrific impairment or this horrific thing happening to us, but through the miraculous assistance of something completely non-miraculous, right, like a wheelchair or a drug or something, right, a surgery, fighting a courageous battle. Right? There's a lot of buzz around this or response in the cancer community, right? There's a commercial that's like, I beat cancer, like I did it, right? Like he had any control over that, right? So the person who lost the battle, right? Somehow that's their own fault, right? Proving you can achieve anything if you really try. Right? And we love that. We love stories about people trying and overcoming, and we love makeovers and stuff, right? This is like the American way, right? We love stories about this. But if you really think about the implications on disabled people or what it assumes about disability, it's really troubling. So the next few slides are from the Today Show, which I watched this morning. I seriously, I don't know why I continue to watch the Today Show. So I have just a few things. I was thinking when I was looking for more images, I thought the Today Show's always, has something about disability. So I just went to the Today Show website and put in disability, and this is what came up. So human interest, right? And you have to be careful. Human interest stuff can get real weird real fast. So human interest, courtesy of the Today Show. And there's the headline direct from the Today Show website is "Man 69 with Disabilities Gets Forever Home." And there's a picture of a man 69 with disabilities, I'm guessing, wearing a Mickey Mouse onesie, it looks like, and he's playing with goats. It gets forever home. Man with disability travels the world on his friend's back. And there's an image of a guy walking with a camping backpack and his friend's in the backpack. Right, this could be, well, I don't think this is news that friends do things together, like travel, right? But there's a lot of underlying assumptions here, right? That disabled people might not have friends, right? That they wouldn't get to travel, that the friend is so magnanimous for being strategic and kind of creative in how they could traverse probably some inaccessible areas, right? But that's what friends do, right? Blind marching band sees beyond disability, and there's an image of the trombone section of what might be a high school marching band, right? Sees beyond disability, right? And to our earlier conversation on language, what does that mean, and why do we have to see beyond disability, right? Could we just assume that these people are competent musicians regardless of disability, and they're also disabled? How to talk to people with disabilities: just say hi. And there's a picture of what might be a father and son smiling and like leaning their heads in toward each other. Right? This morning on the Today Show, I mean, it never ends. So this morning on the Today Show, there was a woman using a power chair, and she was in the street apparently, but the battery died. And so this police officer pushed her the entire way home, and his partner followed in the police car. And can you believe that they did that? And I'm like, yes. Like, what else were they? They're police. So, but again, is that news? Like, what makes that newsworthy? What makes it newsworthy is that we expect nothing from disabled people, right? And we expect non-disabled people to be charitable and kind and helpful. And so this is exactly what we want to hear on a Friday morning when the rest of the news isn't so great. Okay, so the next several slides are images that I have either Googled, and I'll tell you about my little research method, which is not really anything, or that I have just come upon, like they have found me on social media. But so I have just done very simple Google searches for the last few years on disability, or on disability and like one other qualifier. So obviously I'm looking to see how some of these themes are represented. This is like not IRB approved. This is me poking around on my computer, seeing how easy it is to find offensive messaging about disability. So this slide, there's a few images. Disability problem number 22, you're such an inspiration, right? So this is some inspirational stuff. This is from a disabled person's blog right there. So she's identifying this as a thing for her. Then there's a picture of Christopher Reeve in his Superman outfit. I think a hero is an ordinary individual who finds strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming obstacles. And of course, Christopher Reeve played Superman for many years, had a spinal cord injury. He's since passed away, and started the Christopher Reeve Foundation, which at least initially, it might be shifting a little bit now, but was almost entirely focused on curing spinal cord injury, right? Which was really offensive to a lot of folks in the disability community, because there's so much more to disability than finding a cure, right? There's access to resources that we've been talking about. There's sports, there's art, there's activism, there's academia. And this organization had a lot of attention. And I think, you know, it kind of fell back on stereotypes and how they directed their messaging and their funding. Never ignore somebody with a disability. You don't know how much they can inspire you. Share if you agree. And there's an image of what looks like a woman in what is practically a hospital chair, alone on the beach, looking out. We can't see her face because we're looking at her from the back, arms out, right, looking at the beach. And this was on one of my acquaintances' Facebook pages. She's a 2-time Paralympian, and I guess she agreed because she shared it. There's another image of a little girl who is a double amputee below elbow. She's drawing, but she's holding the pencil in her mouth. And it says, "Before you quit, try." And then the last image is a little boy, it looks like. I'm making some assumptions here about all these folks, but trying to describe them. Double amputee, running on blades on a track. Your excuse is invalid. Any reactions to these? This is where I'd love your thoughts or questions or reactions. Somebody's making a barfing gesture, which I appreciate. Barf. Reactions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's way too common. People share this stuff all the time. Oh, look what they're doing. Look what they're accomplishing, perhaps. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. See, that's how you benefit. So back to your earlier question about inspiration and exploitation, I'm going to talk to someone in a wheelchair so I can feel better, right? Which is exactly one of the themes for the microaggressions that we'll get to. Yeah. So that's how you benefit. Right. Exactly. Dorian. It always feels belittling. Oh yeah. It always feels belittling to you, to me as well. Jamie. Yeah. Right. So the underlying message is like, if you think you have it bad, look at these people. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, I know. Right. So if you point these things out to people as offensive, you immediately get labeled as a killjoy. Yeah. Or an angry disabled person. Right. Yeah. One last one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So the before you quit, try kind of implies that people don't try, that they just give up before they even start. Right. So yeah, sure. Right. Some of the things that we identified before, being lazy, right, being sad, right. But also to Jamie's point, like if you think you have it hard, right, like look at this little girl, like before you quit, try. She can do it. You could do it. Right. But really, objectively, this is a little girl drawing.
Come in.
Yes.
I have a question online.
Yes.
States, what do you think is the best way to talk to someone about using this kind of language, parentheses, so that you don't become a killjoy?
I don't really care about becoming a killjoy. You know, I mean, but it's kind of my job, right, to talk about this and educate. There we go. I just accidentally shut the whole monitor off, but we're back. So I don't really care about that. But for people who do, I mean, I think you have to take the opportunities that feel like you can be effective. Which might mean following up later, which might be kind of, I feel this way or I believe this. What do you think? Asking questions, trying to understand. It's hard to say kind of generally, right? Like this is the best way to respond. But, some of it might be not worrying so much about offending another person because you've been offended, right? And I know that sounds nasty, but some of this needs to be addressed. And I think, again, individually or later, you could probably have a more effective conversation after some reflection than in the moment when you're triggered or when there's lots of people around. Go ahead. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. So the folks who create this content and post it aren't necessarily members of the disability community. It certainly does not appear that way, right? This is like a non-disabled perspective, but they wouldn't be asking people in the disability community how this impacts them or makes them feel. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, do we feel that these types of messages or this narrative is getting better on social media? Because I mean, social media is more and more just everywhere, right? Ubiquitous, but they don't lend themselves to conversation. So I don't know. I mean, on some level, I think it can be a really good and effective way to raise awareness or to educate because people have access to it. But when something is problematic, it's also very easy just to be mean, right, in response to a comment or shut somebody down. So I don't know that these are the best places for good dialogue or education. Yeah. I saw your hand and then we'll move on. Yeah. So in response to the social media comment or question, it's about where you go and kind of like curating your own feed or being mindful of the source. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah. And some of it is like survival too. Like I don't really engage in much on social media. Um, Even like in our own professional association, in our own Facebook stuff, I just I don't I don't want to put myself out there in that way because I can't be there to have an effective conversation. And so there's just, I think you have to figure out what works for you in like on that spectrum of activism, right? Some people are out there like strapping themselves to buses and protesting and some people are not. Like some people are teaching classes and some people are writing letters and some people are starting social media campaigns. And I think we have to figure out where we can be effective and where we don't burn out. Okay, I'm going to move on. We are, yeah, story end. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Yeah. I mean, I do. I feel like you're getting to know me very well. So your question is, to the person's the Adobe Connect question that we got about how to be effective in responding to things without being dismissed, right, as angry or a killjoy. If you're in a casual environment with friends and you're the one disabled person and you kind of hear someone say how amazing it is that you can cut your own food, would you respond? And I would. But if I'm out to breakfast with people, I really hope that that is not happening. But I mean, I think we probably all have little things that we've learned or, ways to respond. It's messy and it's not perfect. And, but something around like, really, like I would probably do something like that. Like, come on, like this is not hard. It'd be hard for you. It's not hard for me. But I don't know. I mean, a lot of this is just personal strategies. Um, and like being mindful of what role we're in and what role we're playing, right? So being out to brunch with your friends is different than me teaching a class or being in a meeting at the university, right? Where I actually have a professional obligation, I think, to disrupt some of this stuff versus like, I just want to eat my breakfast, you know? Yeah. I don't know you that well, like the casual. Yeah. I think that's up to you, right? So that I don't know you that well. Do I interrupt and give you a lesson? And I don't know. I really think for me, it depends on the day. It depends on the moment. But if I'm going to stop and give somebody that feedback, it will also ruin my day. I mean, it does, right? And not every interaction with a stranger or even with an acquaintance is going to be effective. And so do I want to enjoy brunch or, educate? And hopefully there's a way to do both, but maybe not. Okay, moving on. We are so behind. Okay, I'm going to kind of go quickly through some of these, but this has been great conversation, so thank you. But this is a slide. There's 5 images that are almost identical. They are all adult wheelchair users outside. Almost all of them are alone. They are all arms out, and you don't really see any of their faces. So the first one going around is a guy, looks like an everyday chair that he's using. He's alone on a pier facing out, like facing away from the camera, so we can't see his face. Arms out, kind of looking out at the water, right, I guess. Going around clockwise, there's a guy using, again, an everyday chair, I think. Out in a field, we are looking at him from the back. We see grass and sky and his arms out. Then there's a woman, bottom right, who is in a hospital chair. We kind of see her from the side. She's outside on an autumn day, arms up, right, both of her arms out. Then the woman in the middle, I'm guessing is a woman. She's also using a hospital chair. She's outside. Mainly what you see is sky. We're looking at her from the side. Also, her arms out, right? 2 arms extended. And then the last image is on a beach. There's someone using a beach chair. So someone's pushing this guy in a beach chair, facing the water, arms out. Like, I love this slide, right? I just think this is so common, right? To have wheelchair users alone outside who just look so happy. Like, what do you make of this, really? Like, these images are not hard to find. I don't know. Is it code? Is arms out code for something? I don't know. What do you think it means? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. We made it out. Yeah. So what you're saying is arms out kind of means they've accomplished something, they're proud of themselves, and so maybe here it's like they made it outside, right? Especially like some hospital chairs, right? They're outside. I think also interesting, they're almost all alone, and the person who is not alone is being helped, right? It's unclear as to whether or not they're friends. Everyone else is alone, and everyone looks pretty white, right? So I want to put that out there too, that, as I've done these types of searches for images, there's a lot of white people. It's very hard to find non-white, visibly disabled people. So I just want to put that out there as kind of a finding. Moving on to the next slide, there's an older woman using a hospital chair. She's being pushed by what looks like a younger woman, both of their heads cut off. Next image is 2 people on the beach. One's pushing another one using a wheelchair. It's sunset. It's like a silhouette, and then it's the beach. There's also no tracks on the sand, which I just realized a few weeks ago. They magically just got there. The next image is what looks like 2 women. One woman is using a wheelchair. It's practically a hospital chair, but it's not quite. She's a single amp, and there's a woman behind her kind of either pushing her or kind of touching her back, and they're looking at each other, and they're both just really happy. The next image is maybe a family. I don't know. There's an adult male using a wheelchair. He's being pushed by an adult female, and there's a kid bouncing a basketball next to them, so they might be out for an evening walk. And then the last 2 images are plays on the accessibility symbols, so the wheelchair kind of international access symbol. One is 2 white hands, like, kind of stick figure-y hands, that are holding up the access symbol. And then the image in the center is a white hand that is the wheel of the wheelchair of the access symbol. Right? A little creepy. Right? So there's your helping. I'm going to keep going kind of quickly. There's a very steep staircase, probably like a subway station. Painted over the staircase is Mount Everest, and at the bottom it says, for some, it's Mount Everest. Yes. There's like groans, right? Disability is a matter of perception. If you can do just one thing you're needed by someone. Martina Navratilova quote. And there's two hands vertically reaching for each other. There's a big blue hand reaching down for the little pink hand, and the hands are made of hearts. Limitations live only in our minds. And there's an image there, a photograph of an adult guy, double amp, doing what looks like a long jump on a track. So limitations live only in our minds. This is where things went south of the head last year. Attitudes are the real disability, little quote. And then there's something that says, never, never, never give up. And it's, again, sunset. It's a silhouette. It's what looks like a little kid in an ill-fitted hospital chair. It's way too big for him or her, and their arms are up. Right? So this limitations live only in our minds, right? I want us to really think about that with respect to disability, because these are the messages that are very confusing to disabled people and to non-disabled people. You know, I think if we were to use that quote as a way to inspire other groups, like if we went to an under-resourced school to motivate them to go to college and we said, limitations live only in your mind. No, right? There are structural barriers, right, that we're not great at talking about, but I think we're a little further along with some other communities. Disability does not live only in my mind. I can pray harder, work harder, try harder, have the best attitude, and I will always have this impairment. P.S. That's okay with me, right? But that's confusing, right? It's further emphasizing this idea that if you just were a better person, right, if you just tried harder, you wouldn't be in this situation. I'm going to keep going. There is no greater disability in society than the inability to see a person as more. See the person, not the disability. And there's little stick figures around this quote, and they're colorful, very stereotypically like men and women, like the bathroom symbol. And their shadows are little wheelchairs. So their shadows are little wheelchairs, but they're standing up. So that's cool. Higher beyond the disability, little quote. And these are both parts of like in workplace incentive programs to hire disabled employees. Hire, yes, HIRE, so hire employees, hire beyond the disability. Again, what if we hired because of the disability or as well, right? Disability being one of many things that make someone interesting. Last image is a double amp. He's surfing. The only disability in life is a bad attitude. And that, again, is similar to the limitations live only in our minds, right? I don't know if it's the last one. This next slide, there's 3 almost identical images. Word disability written in kind of in handwriting, and the dis of the word disability being crossed out in red ink by a white man's hand. So we're crossing out the dis to just leave ability. There's don't diss my ability. That is one of our colleagues across the country. Their DS office uses that as a slogan for its student club. Don't diss my ability. Student disability services. This ability, not disability. National Organization on Disability. So these are the word disability is printed, and either the dis is small or the ability is big. And then the last image is kind of cartoony, and it's the word disability, but ability is under a magnifying glass. So all you see is the ability, right? Similar to our conversation earlier, right? Disability is so bad that we cross it out, we hire beyond, we see beyond, but really saying it and naming it is where the power is, right? If you are a disabled person and you've grown up with these messages, it's confusing. I think it's confusing. And it perpetuates the idea that disability is just really negative. Someone I love needs a cure. Support autism research, right? And there's the blue puzzle piece to indicate the autism research campaign. Someone I love needs a cure, not I want a cure, right? Going back to the non-disability gaze, if you will. Run it for kids who can't, our fundraiser. Watch the emotional moment. Her hearing implant is switched on, and there are what look like 2 adult white women, again, looking at each other crying. Don't worry, my disability isn't contagious, but my smile is, and there's a cartoon little kid looking proud of himself. A cure to be free again. Chronic spinal cord injury must become curable. And there's a drawing of chains, and right over the breaking of the chains, it says cure. Love, hope, cure, mental health awareness. Love, hope, faith, cure, mental health awareness, right? Kind of going back to some of the historical thinking about perhaps religion or sinning or whatever. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost and now I'm found. Once was blind and now I see. Some religious connections. A few more. There's a black and white photograph of an adult man, looks like, pushing himself in a hospital chair. It looks like he's really pushing himself. And his shadow is jumping up out of the chair, arms up. The next image, it must be a code. Yeah, I feel like the non-chair users should tell me what that means then. The next image is an adult woman, blonde, white woman, and she's using one of those exoskeletons, right? Which is something that you kind of strap your legs into and it walks for you, what I think it is. And her everyday chair is kind of off in the background. And this is like a nice chair, actually. So many of the other images were hospital chairs. This one's really nice. I don't understand how using this like robotic walking machine is less conspicuous than that wheelchair. But walking, people are very, very, like they're inordinately interested in walking and walking again. And I mean, I should clarify that there are people who want to walk again, see again, hear again. That's fine, right? People want a cure. People want to be fixed. People want treatments or therapies. Cool. There are also a lot of people who don't, or who can't and don't. And we don't hear about those people. All we hear about in the media or see in the media is cure, 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 fix, fix, fix. And that's not a fair representation of disability. Then the last image there is from Glee, which has been off the air for a few years. Artie, who is the regularly occurring character, non-disabled actor playing a wheelchair user. His friends, do y'all remember this episode? For Christmas, they pool their resources and they rent him. They didn't even buy him, right? A walking machine. And so he's there standing up, looking happy, and they're all standing around like in tears of joy. Then there's a slide with some villains. There's Scar from The Lion King, who has a scar over his eye. Freddy Krueger, who was burned and has kind of, I don't know, blades for fingers. There's Captain Hook, who's an amputee. Right? So most villains have some sort of impairment. So if you think about Disney, really if you think about almost any villain has some disabling characteristic or some characteristic that just makes them a little scarier. And probably the most horrifying image on this slide is a photograph of an accessible parking spot that says every 48 seconds, a drunk driver makes another person eligible to park here. Right? That's a public service announcement or campaign about drunk driving. So not every however many seconds a drunk driver kills someone, worse, disables them. There's a slide on superheroes from, this is a disability studies blog, I don't remember whose, but with great power comes great disability. Right? So that's, of course, a play on the Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. So if you think about superheroes as kind of a metaphor for difference, right? You have some people who were born with a special difference. You have some people who acquire a special difference. You have some folks who like live and work together in some sort of team or league, right? You have people who hide their differences and people who share them. But I think the takeaway is that you're not really allowed to be an ordinary disabled person in the media. I think we're seeing that. So you have to be a superhero, right? You have to be super. The super crip is a disability studies term for someone who's just so amazing and so great and so cool that you don't even see their disability. So superheroes, and there's, I think is it Dr. Horrible from Wonder Woman? I never remember this. There's Daredevil, who's blind. There's Mystique, who's blue. And there's Professor X, who uses a chair. I'm going to go very quickly over this. This is Me Before You, a movie that came out 2 years ago. There's the movie poster of two white people, man and a woman. The guy is a non-disabled actor who plays a quad, who's a high-level spinal cord injury. So basically, this was a book turned into a movie. There's a sequel to the book. I hope there's not a sequel to the movie, but the lead character in the movie is rich and good looking and has everything going for him until he breaks his neck and he wants to end his life. And does, spoiler alert. And this is a movie that was produced 2 years ago about disability when there's such little representation of disability in the media. So I went to Metacritic, which is just a compilation of various reviews for movies, and found these gems. Extended trailer shows Will Traynor, the character's devastating accident, Us Weekly. Forgive me if I temporarily shelve my customary cynicism in favor of commerce. It goes down smooth as sherry. New York Observer. The bittersweet ending of Me Before You may make you cry, even if an hour later you may not remember why. Cheerful and efficient. Time. Ultimately, compare Me Before You to other weepy adaptations. It fares pretty well. Your mom will love it, and you'll secretly love it too. Time Out London. Okay, there's a non-disabled actor, like I mentioned, and there was a response from the disability community. Disability activists did call in for many radio interviews. Some people are nodding like they remember this, but they didn't get very far, right? The volume was turned down, the call was over, and we didn't really hear about a response from the disability community, which might suggest that we're all just okay with this messaging. Okay, now we're going to shift to microaggressions in the next 10 minutes. I'm going to start skipping, but so the definition of a microaggression is an everyday verbal, nonverbal, or environmental slight, snub, or insult, can be intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to disabled people, in this example, based solely upon their group membership or disability status. So this is the definition of microaggressions, but I've tailored it a little to this conversation on disability. So microaggressions are not just about disability, right? They come initially to analyze racism. I'm going to skip a little bit. So one of the really leading researchers and scholars on microaggressions defines it, or describes it rather, as death by 1,000 cuts. Right? So any of these things in isolation might not be enough to kill you. But when you keep getting cut in the same spot over and over and over again, it makes a pretty devastating impact. So these are the themes that 2 disabled researchers found. There's one chapter in a book that I found so far. There's a lot of emerging research in this whole area, and more stuff coming out, and the references are here at the end. So the denial of identity. So this is how they believe, 2 disabled researchers believe disabled people experience microaggressions. Denial of identity. So to help qualify that, I threw in inspiration, right, as a denial of an identity, right? I'm not just here to benefit you. I actually have an identity around my disability. Maybe the idea of disability is a choice, right? Like, well, if you went to therapy, or if you got some sun, or, right? Avoidance, right? So the idea that disabled people are often avoided in groups, in public. I think design has a lot to do with that. I think design separates and segregates people and perpetuates this type of avoidance. Helplessness and secondary gain, going back to our conversation on, someone benefiting. But the idea that disabled people are helpless, and that when non-disabled people help them, the non-disabled person benefits. So that's the secondary gain. I feel good when I help you. Desexualization, right? Perhaps evidenced in Me Before You. The idea that disabled people would never be romantic partners, would never be beautiful, they're never cast as the boyfriend or the girlfriend, or right? I mean, they're desexualized. The denial of privacy, that can be staring, that can be what happened to you, that can be all the questions that you get. The attention that we mentioned very early on, the preferential treatment, just a lot of attention. And, for me, sometimes I'm like, I just want to go somewhere and not have anybody pay any attention to me. It never happens. Patronization or infantilization. So kind of how we condescend disabled people, we infantilize them. A lot of these images that I found were of younger children. We patronize them, maybe talk down to them, talk differently to them. The spread effect is what the authors define as kind of the disability or the impairment is, it has no bounds. You know, it's just, you're just disabled, right? Everything has kind of spread. So if you're deaf, you're blind. If you're blind, you're a chair user, right? There's no boundaries. It's just, you're completely disabled. And then the last theme that they identify is that disabled people are treated like second-class citizens and that they're ultimately a burden. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to go. I tried to look up some, I was honestly trying to find people of color who are disabled, and I found a few things. But these are some narratives, right? We're not going to listen to them. I don't even have them linked. But people who are going to the internet, starting, you know, vlogs or blogs, and really as disabled people, talking about how they experience microaggressions. So this is a younger woman. She looks like a person of color to me. Her name is Annie Elaney, and she's talking in this particular episode about how to spot a fake disability. Remember, we talked about disabled people as liars earlier, right? You know, people are taking advantage of the system, and that's why you get to park there, get your extended time, right? This is stuff, maybe the denial of identity, right, that you're lying. This is Stella Young, we mentioned earlier. So she does her whole TED Talk about inspiration porn. So it's called I'm Not Your Inspiration. Thank you very much. And then this last image is an African-American woman, and the title of her vlog or whatever is called Sitting Pretty with Lolo, and I love that title. And this is where she is reacting to how many times she gets asked what's wrong with her. So it says, what's wrong with you? Then I did read the comments, which I never do. I just took a screenshot. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 comments, but they're all young people, and this is a very supportive community. So these were all young people who were writing in solidarity. I get that too. Good for you. And it was really nice. So I thought I'd share that. So I have a bunch of examples. We don't have time to go through them, and I really apologize for that. But I think it's important to talk about language when questions come up. Maybe I'll read out a few. These are the ones that we can share. So I've compiled many, many examples of various types of microaggressions that either have happened to me, I mean, I could go on, but have happened at U of A, right? Students kind of report them to us, my friends, my colleagues. These are things that we're going to hand them out. These are things that people share or I have observed. And so the reason I wanted to share examples in this presentation is not necessarily so people feel like, oh God, it really does suck to have a disability, right? I mean, because this is for me, I will really try to speak from my own experience. Microaggressions is the worst part of it for me. It's not my impairment. It's not walking. It's not the chair. It is other people, right? And they're unavoidable. And like we kind of chatted about earlier, even though you know things happen a lot, they always come out of nowhere. They're always really kind of stunning. And they leave me reeling for days sometimes, because I should have been able to answer that. I should have responded, or wow, I'm still thinking about this. I feel so bad. And don't let yourself feel so bad, right? This is in your control. Use positive thinking. This is the stuff that goes on in my head. And I know that I'm not alone in this as a member of the disability community, but this is a way that disabled people experience oppression, because that's a burden, right? And it makes me as like, I would describe myself as like a happy person, but it makes me feel very heavy. So I think sharing these examples, one, I hope really relay how pervasive and consistent these incidents are, but will help us in our advocacy work or our roles with respect to the disability community, maybe get a little better at responding or educating, right? Because if something is, you know, well, I don't know why she got so upset about this, you can say, well, that's a denial of her identity, right? That's something that she experiences pretty much constantly. So let's imagine the impact that might make year after year, right? Day after day. So the example that's up here, just as one example, because we're going to wrap up, Julio tells Ana that he's having a hard time managing his anxiety during midterms. Ana responds by saying that this happens to everyone and he should just try exercise. right? These are the things, right? She's probably their friends, right? From what I know about this situation, probably trying to be helpful or supportive, but it's dismissive, right? So this might be denial of identity. Do one more. Derek asks Mariah, a woman with visible scars on her body, what happened to you? Denial of privacy. And so these are interesting. Like, they're all really rich. I've heard people ask me questions, my friends, my colleagues questions, and then when we respond with kind of an attitude or feeling like a little confused or surprised, it's, I just want to ask. Isn't it better to ask? Right? How are we supposed to learn if we can't talk about these things? Okay, fine. Also true, but that's a denial of someone's privacy, right? Because chances are that person did not invite that question, and it's probably just having brunch, right? Waiting in line, right? Sitting somewhere minding their own business, and it's the, whoa, what happened to you? Right? It's disruptive. So if we can start to understand some of these very, very common experiences in that larger framework, academic framework perhaps, I think we can do a lot to validate the experiences of the disabled people in this example who have been victims of microaggressions, but be more effective, right, in connecting it to something else other than she just must be really sensitive. So I'm going to stop here. It's 5, but are there last questions or reactions, things that you're still kind of thinking about?
Amanda,
yes.
I have Grace online, and earlier she asked a question before you started going through the imagery slides, and I think you're kind of touching on things a little bit, but she was asking, can you speak to less obvious disabilities? So maybe placing in context something that the mental illness, stuff like that, with your slide.
Sure. I think that's an excellent point and something that I should have mentioned earlier. You know, when I'm searching for images, we're looking at visible representation. And so, of course, we're going to see a lot of wheelchair users and maybe some other very kind of obvious examples of disability. Like we mentioned, a lot of them are white, which is a theme, but overwhelmingly wheelchair users. So if you are someone with an invisible disability, you probably don't see yourself, right, in this conversation or in these images or in these communities because it's hard to present something invisible in a visible way. But I think that's also a problem, and I think it keeps the conversation focused on physical disability and physical access, or sensory disability and access related to folks with obvious impairments. And I mean, there's a lot of work to do there too. But there's not a lot of space, I think, sometimes in the community, and I think that contributes when you have to disclose something that is not apparent. That's also a burden, right? That's a tough one. And then where do you get support, or where are your role models? Hard to say, right? Because it's not as easy to identify someone with an invisible disability as it is a chair user. So I think, to Grace's point, you know, we don't do a great job of really representing a diverse, rich, nuanced perspective on disability. And I think that can further contribute to, you know, how disparate the disability community is. So in our work and in our lives, we need to be good at intentionally pulling in, right, diverse experiences. I mean, one takeaway from this talk is we all need to do this intentionally. Like, we need to challenge things. We need to find things. We need to ask those questions. We will not get this anywhere else, right? Outside of a disability studies class or a Disability Heritage Month event, right? This is not what's out in mainstream media. This is not what you see on the Today Show. It's not what you read in the newspaper. It's not what you see in the movies. So you cannot rely on society and media to teach us. We have to hold each other accountable, and we have to do this work really intentionally. So in kind of thinking about that initial overview, we started with history and we're ending with our practices and our attitudes and our belief. This is what's out there, right? And a lot of these dynamics shape the disability experience. So we have to be intentional about challenging them and disrupting them in our lives and in our work. Any other questions, thoughts? Cool. Thank you so much. Such a good conversation.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I just want to, as I said from the start, I hope what I was telling you came true. Leaving here with that energy around these conversations and about doing this intentional work. I think Amanda really does a great job of presenting this to us and helping us understand what that work is on a deeper level and how that impacts people and how we can work to make that change and make that difference. So thank you all for being here on this Friday afternoon. Thank you, Amanda, again, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. We hope to see you at many of the events this month, and we'll see you around. What's that? Or you can come to a CDAD meeting, which the next one is October 17th at 12 o'clock in Havasupai C. Join us. We invite you all.
Amanda, Grace says she appreciates your response.
I decided last night that I am co-chimney. What? Co-chimney. Co-chair in name. Oh. You already did.